Welcome back, everybody. It is now my honor to introduce our panel discussion today. We have a panel discussion about the Hawaii fisheries, its recent past, what's currently happening, and what's happening in the near future. And I'd like to first introduce MACNA's Director of Conservation, Tim Lyons, who will then introduce our panel members. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? I'm happy to be here and happy to have such an awesome assortment of knowledge on this topic with us today. So like Kevin said, I'm MACNA's Director of Conservation. I'm also a Species Survival Officer at the New Mexico Biopark Society, and I work in close collaboration with the IUCN to assess extinction risk of aquatic organisms and also develop spatial and national conservation planning tools. With us today, also in the room, we've got Bruce Carlson. Bruce was the director of the Waikiki Aquarium from 1990 to 2002, and the chief science officer of the Georgia Aquarium from 2002 to 2011. Bruce has been an active proponent of Hawaii's sustainable ornamental fisheries and also a pretty integral voice in the discussion over the last few decades. We have Bob Lickens with us as well. He's the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council. Bob and PJAC have been completely integral in the generation and submittal of an environmental assessment to the Hawaii Office of Environmental Quality Control after the Hawaiian Supreme Court that issued additional collection permits banned pending that kind of an environmental assessment. We also have Paula Carlson. She's the Director of Husbandry at the Dallas World Aquarium, an AZA accredited facility here in Texas. Paul has been a strong advocate of the roles that zoos and aquariums play in the conservation of species that are housed within their collections. We also have with us Kim Koch, spokesperson for aquarium fishermen in West Hawaii, and also an outspoken advocate of the sustainability of the Hawaiian ornamental fishery. So as we start here, I'm going to let these four take over the discussion for the most part, because they have just so much knowledge and information about how this discussion has developed over the last couple of decades. But it's my hope that together, the broad perspectives and intimate familiarity of this group with how the discussion has developed might be able to shed some further light on this relatively controversial fishery, its current closure, what the data say versus what the public media says about the sustainability of the fishery, how this affects the greater aquarium industry, and also what hobbyists can do to support the sustainable development of our shared hobby. So before we get into some of the more pivotal points surrounding this discussion, I just want to go into a little bit of background and current situation of the West Hawaii fishery. So I think this is probably best directed at Kim and Bruce. Why is the West Hawaii fishery controversial, and how have conversations developed over the years to the point that we are at now?
I would say it's really not controversial. That's kind of one of the talking points of the opposition that has essentially shut us down to this point. There's a very small group, and as you know, most of the outspoken people have the loudest voice, and that group of people is primarily from Maui County. So as far as being a controversial fishery, it really is not.
And so how have these conversations developed over the years, Kim, from where they started to where we're at now?
You know, you have two groups of people, I guess you could say, that dislike the fishery. One group is somewhat reasonable and they believe in science and sustainability. And back 25 years ago, that group helped to implement the West Hawaii fishery as we know it today. And that group began to see that the management plan that was implemented back in 1999 played out. The numbers don't lie, and they are happy with where the fishery is, was, and will be in the future. And that group, the Lost Fish Coalition, has now become a strong supporter of the fishery. Unfortunately, you have the other group that is totally opposed to fish as pets. And they have teamed up with the Humane Society, the Center for Biological Diversity, Earth Justice. I mean, the list goes on. And they've really gotten big money behind them to really focus on our fishery and shut it down.
And Bruce, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think it's a broad statement. I'd like to say that if the West Hawaii aquarium fishery can't be saved, and it's the best managed aquarium fishery in the world, in fact, it's the best managed inshore fishery of any kind in Hawaii. If it can't be saved with all the data and all the work that's been going on all these years, I don't hold out much hope for any other ornamental fishery, which has far less data. But a lot of this, as Tim was saying, is related to an intense public relations campaign that has turned a large part of the public and politicians who listen to the public against the fishery. Bob will probably say more about that recent incidents and so forth. But it's been an intense campaign against this fishery. And again, that's in light of 20 years of hard science, good data, the best data in the world, in fact, for an inshore fishery. And yet here we are. It's shut down, and I don't know what the prospects are. They're kind of dim for the fishery reopening, but Bob will have to comment where we are at the moment.
This is a question to the whole group. What major steps have ultimately resulted in the closure of the fishery after a unanimous rejection of the environmental impact statement produced in conjunction with PJAC by the Hawaiian Board of Land and Natural Resources? And this happened on April 23rd, 2020, so it's a relatively recent development.
The results of the recent appeal of the EIS decision by the land board is really frustrating and a little confounding to us. We really believe that it's a fantastic document that really looks at all the available science, and it just feels like the decision was made that the fishery wasn't going to be reopened, and then they went back after the fact and tried to justify it when they produced the written decision on why they decided that. The Department of Land and Natural Resources staff agreed that it was an acceptable environmental impact statement. You know, we had several times during this process, we've had peer reviews done on it. And Bruce may be able to speak to this more, but quite a few pretty reputable scientists spoke out after the fact and basically asked the question, if the science doesn't matter anymore, why do we bother doing this? So it is a very frustrating thing, and we will, you know, our primary interest is making sure we can get the fishers back in the water earning a living sustainably. And so we will look at how we need to address it and what we can do to go forward, but it's frustrating.
Yeah, certainly everyone should know of Dr. William Walsh, Bill Walsh, who's been working for over 20 years. He and I were graduate students together back in the 70s, and he began his interest in my interest as well, with the aquarium fishery way back in the 70s. And since the late 1990s, he's been working with a group monitoring systematically monitoring the populations of fishes in areas where collecting is allowed and where collecting is off limits. And it's really only because of his data that I think we are where we are. Otherwise, we would be totally reliant upon anecdotes on both sides. It's really a sad commentary that anecdotes have actually won, whereas the hard science, and we're talking about reams of data, thousands of dives, tens of thousands of data points, graphs that conclusively show that this fishery is sustainable, and yet here we are. It's unbelievable. But anecdotes can be spun in a way that sounds horrible, that appeals to a broad part of the public who has no interest in science, wouldn't understand the graph if it was presented to them. When they're told what's going on and the purposelessness of aquariums, why should people have these fish? They should be in the ocean. Those arguments win the day. Science really doesn't have anything to do with it in the end. It's a real sad commentary on where we are. But the opposition has learned how to focus its efforts. I think they've learned from other national campaigns and other methods of how to distort reality to win public approval, and that's kind of where we are. And unfortunately, many of the people who make policy decisions seem to have fallen under that spell. That's the best word to use. If not that, at least they're listening to the public, and the public has become very jaded. So if you're a politician who's been voted in, you're going to listen to your constituents who vote you in, and not a small group of people who are dependent on this fishery for a living. So I'm sorry to be kind of a heavy downer on all of this, but it's been a very, very disappointing story to follow for many decades now, and where we are at this moment.
One thing that you've touched on in the past, Bruce, is defining sustainable in a way that levels the playing field for the discussion. Can you do that for us now and maybe provide an example or two of how the term sustainable has been used differently in the past to the benefit of one side or the other?
I looked around for a definition of sustainable that I've used in testimony at the legislature, and with Bill Walsh's help, he provided the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and their definition of sustainable. Basically, fishing is sustainable when it can be conducted over the long term at an acceptable level of biological and economic productivity without leading to ecological changes that foreclose options for future generations. In other words, that you can remove or extract a resource without harming that resource, and also without harming the environment around it for an indefinite period of time. And I believe that the West Hawaii aquarium fishery data shows that indeed it is sustainable, that the graph should be going like this for the population densities if it was unsustainable. But if you look at it, the population trend over the last 20 years, even in fished areas, has been steady. It goes up and down, but if you drew a line through it, it would be steady or increasing with fishing. That tells you very strongly that this fishery by definition is sustainable. Where the term, and this is why I think the term has to be defined in any argument, because people will just say sustainable without their basis for what does that term mean. And I think, listening to the opposition, their definition of sustainable is pristine. In other words, that the population would be the same whether it was fished or unfished. So that is impossible. If you're removing a resource, you're going to have fewer animals, fewer fish in this situation than you would in an area that's unfished. It just, you're taking some fish out. They want them to be the same. That's what they call sustainable. So I think it's really important to have that definition up front in any discussion where sustainability becomes an issue.
And let's talk about pristine for a moment too. This is a discussion point for the entire group. The ornamental fishery has often been cited as one of the primary drivers of decline for Hawaiian reef fish populations. What other factors are there? Be it runoff, the influence of other fisheries that are not supplying the ornamental trade, ocean warming and acidification in a broader context. What are some of these other factors that may be accounting for non-pristine reefs in Hawaii that could also be driving these declines? And out of those, are we accounting for all those factors in this discussion? Is the opposition to the aquarium fishery accounting for them, and are proponents of the aquarium fishery accounting for them?
Let me just jump in. You said declines in fishery populations. In fact, the aquarium fish populations, for the most part, have been increasing, not decreasing. So I think, let me just go back to your argument and make that correction in the first case. The yellow tang and colley, for example, the population since 1999 have generally been increasing that entire time. So there is no decline there. Are the reefs the same as they were 20 years ago? No. We've had several major coral bleaching events in the past few years. We've had significant loss of Passophora corals, for example. And it's still too recent to know, if they're going to come back in the same numbers as they were before. It's a fast-growing and fast-populating species of coral, so that may come back very quickly. I don't think, up until just last year, I don't think we've seen any point where the fish populations have suffered because of coral bleaching events. Although just the last few data points in the graph show somewhat of a decline, but that could also just be a natural, they go up and down over the years anyway. So we'll just have to wait and see as more data comes in how that changes. Everything else that you mentioned sure is a factor that causes decline or degradation of the general environment. Pollution, sediment, sedimentation, ocean acidification, coral bleaching has been the biggest one lately. But in general, the fish populations, the ornamental fish populations, the aquarium species are generally doing quite well.
I think that when you are talking sustainability, pristine, things of that nature, and possible declines with regards to aquarium fish, specifically in Hawaii, I think you need to take it back a step and realize that the size of the fish that the aquarium industry targets are, these fish typically get consumed before they actually become reproductive and truly even counted in the data, because most of the data, if you look at the data, it excludes year of young. It says YOY not included. So when we're talking about the west side of Hawaii having 11 million colley and 8 million yellow tangs, just in the 30 to 60 foot depth range, the fish that the aquarium fishermen are taking are not even counted in that population. So if the fishermen take these fish, or nature consumes them, other fish take them, other fishermen take them, they're not even being calculated and counted. So, I think it's 1% of the fish actually make it from larval size to a reproductive size fish. And on the yellow tang, it's around 4.5 inches. So the fish that are being taken, you're talking pristine sustainability numbers. You've got to kind of take that into context. And like Bruce was saying, the numbers are continuing to climb, and those fish are year of young fish or larger before they're even counted. So the population is actually a lot higher than what the numbers even say.
Bruce or Kim, unlike some of the states or countries that our listeners are in, what are the fishing regulations for just the general population in West Hawaii or in Hawaii in general?
So in West Hawaii, it's one of the most heavily regulated fisheries. There is gear restrictions. Gear has to be labeled. Boats have to be registered. You have to fish with the scarlet letters. You have to have big AQ labeled all over your boat so everyone's well aware of what those specific fishermen are doing. On top of that, through the last 20 or so years of data and studies Dr. Bill conducted, he, along with the fishermen, the opposition, community members, all sorts of stakeholders, came up with a list that they deemed sustainable for take, and that was dubbed a whitelist. And that's a 40 species whitelist that the fishermen are allowed to take from. And the top 3 species of fish, which comprise 97% of the total catch for West Hawaii, have bag limits or slot limits attached to them to protect the breeding size. So like on the yellow tangs, 2 inches or below, they were deemed finicky for transit and take. So those guys stay on the reef. And anything above 4.5 inches, you're allowed. That was just a bag limit for catching error. You're not really down there with a measuring tape. So that it was the buffer zone to allow those fish, once they become breeding size, if they make it through the chain, nature doesn't consume them, aquarium fishermen don't consume them. Those guys are protected for the rest of their lives until a local comes and spears them or throws a net on them. But for all intents and purposes, it's quite regulated.
Now, Kim, tell them what recreational fishermen and what regulations recreational fishermen have.
So the unique thing is, I'm sure many of the viewers go out fishing with their kids to a lake, anything, and every state, I believe, has some sort of recreational license. Most states you can go into Walmart or your local sportsman's warehouse and get that license, but the state of Hawaii has zero license, zero restriction, zero data on any take, and being that it's an island, all of the fish cross over. I mean, people, if it swims, if it lives in the ocean, if it crawls, it's getting consumed in some way, shape, or form, and there's zero regulations. And if it was truly a resource issue, like the opposition claims, they would be targeting the rest of the 1.4 million people in the state and not roughly 45 fishermen that are spread out over, hundreds of miles of coastline that are regulated, studied, monitored, and everything else. So Hawaii's kind of a backwards place.
Yeah, basically for recreational fishermen, it would be very difficult for the state to come in and start regulating, even asking people to pay for a fishing license. We're talking, again, as Tim mentioned, only a handful of aquarium fishermen who can't put much of a fuss, create much of a fuss because there's so few of them. But when you're talking about recreational fishermen, we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that go out fishing with, spear fishing, hook and line and so forth, little nets for whatever the purpose. Trying to regulate them in any way is just going, it's like our birthright to be able to do whatever we want. So basically there would be so much opposition that they haven't even tried to introduce anything. And yet the impact hasn't even been measured or calculated because there's so many of them, and really nothing has really been focused on that particular fishery. And yet we're focused on the one that is managed, for which we have data. That's the one being shut down. It makes no sense at all.
Bob, I was going to ask you, and I think you can chime in here. Like we've been battling this for 10 years, and all of a sudden, more than that, even what's changed. And you wanted to comment on Bruce's.
Well, yeah, the bottom line on this is it's obvious that the aquarium fishery is not an impactful fishery. It's a few fishers spread out over a huge area collecting. The simple example is when food fish fishers report their catch, they report it in kilograms. When the aquarium fishery reports its catch, it's an individual fish. What the aquarium fishery takes is not even rounding error, but what the aquarium fishery does have that makes it attractive to groups that want to shut it down is it has a small group of people trying to defend their jobs that are not well organized, and it doesn't mess with the state's cash cows like tourism or commercial food fish. So it makes an inviting target to set precedents with. And unfortunately, the fishers in Hawaii just end up a victim of that situation. They're an easy target, so they're being targeted.
So what happened recently then, unlike in 2015 or in 2012 when I was first kind of brought into these issues? What changed with the 2019-2020 season? And
well, I can let Kim speak to some of the background on the local politics that have evolved over time. I've been with PJAC since 2015, and Hawaii very quickly became a big part of my portfolio. And we see every year in Hawaii, we see an effort in the legislature to try and shut down the fishery, and it's the same people that are trying to do this. And succeeding to this point and doing this through the courts. They have the money to continue to advance these efforts. We have had a couple of close calls with the legislature. Luckily, the governor's office a few years ago did take serious consideration of the science that was presented by Bruce and others, and actually vetoed a bill that would have shut down the fishery when a large group of scientists came out and said, basically, this is ridiculous. That effort will continue every year. We know it's going to happen. The justification for it evolves from year to year as they lose, and I'm sure it'll be something new again next year. But the court case has been a real challenge. In 2017, the state Supreme Court decided that the state was not allowed to issue aquarium fishing licenses without doing an environmental assessment. So we at PJAC got together with the fishers, pooled our resources, and did an environmental assessment. And the state said, well, that's nice, but it's not good enough. Do a full environmental impact statement. So we did that, and honestly invested a lot of time and money, much of it coming from people who are out of work right now, the fishers in West Hawaii, and completed a really comprehensive and fantastic document in our environmental impact statement. It got a passing review by the land board, who decided it was insufficient. We appealed that decision on quite a few bases, and the Office of Environmental Quality Control sided with the state on the majority of them. So we are going back to the drawing board again in order to try and get the fishers back in the water. But you know, it is frustrating that after going through this whole process, much of which we had to really make up from scratch because the state does not have a precedent on how to do something like this for a fishery. The environmental impact statements in the past have been for something like building a hotel, where you can tell how many square feet you're going to tear up. And let's face it, once the hotel is there, nothing's ever going to grow in that spot again. The fishery is different. The fish come back. So it has been a complex problem and a frustrating process to this point, but we will continue to march forward.
Yeah, Bob, could you relate a bit during the hearing before the board? I was not present at that. I think it was during the pandemic when travel was a little bit restricted, difficult to get there. But my understanding was they didn't ask any scientists anything at all about the data and how it supported the fishery. Is that correct, that the board was basically not very interested in the data?
It's difficult to say what they were interested in. You know, in fairness to the board, we don't see everything they look at. We attended the call. It was done basically as a Zoom call. We attended the call and had the opportunity to speak at the beginning, but they took testimony from folks or comments from folks during the meeting, but they also received thousands of pages of written comments that we don't see. So in fairness to them, we weren't going to see everything. But you are right. You would think that the board would have actually called some scientists to try and distill down this 2,000-page report. And in a sense, I guess you could say they had, because the report, the environmental impact statement, had the blessing of the DLNR staff. So from that regard, it had been reviewed by the state scientist and found to be acceptable. And that was not the legal and written standard for having our EIS accepted is not what the board chose to follow.
And I think an interesting point too is that same land board was reviewing state data. So for them not to approve a document containing their own scientist data, Dr. Bill Walsh and the 20 plus years of work he put into West Hawaii, that really just tells you how backwards Hawaii is. And I think to follow up on food fisheries or resource fisheries compared to aquarium fisheries, food fisheries are typically top down. They protect smaller sizes. you know, a fisherman goes out, he wants the larger fish to feed his family or whatever. So in essence, they're killing themselves. They're taking their breeding population. So of course you're going to see declines as population grows, more tourists come, more activity on the ocean, and you're targeting all the larger fish with very little, if any, regulations. You're going to see decline. And that's why even the crossover species that we have, you know, the aquarium fishery is more of a bottom up. We target the ones that are already getting consumed in the environment, and the ones that do make it to breeding size, like Cole and things of that nature, the FRA system and the no-take areas that we've implemented really have paid dividends through the last 20 years because the numbers are through the roof, and those species in particular are targeted for food and aquarium.
Bob or Bruce, when a public aquarium or a hobbyist is at their local store, or they're approaching a wholesaler, in the case of the public aquariums, and they see what they presume are Hawaiian fish currently in the trade or in that local fish store, where are those coming from currently? Is the current Hawaiian fishery shut down?
The West Hawaiian fishery is shut down. The way the regulations work in Hawaii, the entire licensing process in Hawaii was actually a license to use a fine mesh net to catch aquarium fish, a practice that is prohibited without this special license. So that is in effect throughout the state. West Hawaii has additional regulations and an additional license required that it was decided when the fine mesh net permits were pulled that they would also pull their permits for West Hawaii. So that eliminated their access to the fishery management area, which means the only opportunity to fish in West Hawaii would be to go outside of that, where there are a lot of challenges that Kim can speak to better with regard to ocean surf levels and fish populations, and what the bottom looks like, and just plain how far it is. So there is virtually no opportunity still to fish in West Hawaii. In Oahu, fishers can still fish, they just cannot use a fine mesh net in order to do it. So they are continuing to collect through other methods that are both less efficient and less safe for the fish. So it is not an ideal situation, but there are still some Hawaiian fish in the pipeline. Talking to folks that import them into the continental US, I will tell you that they say the numbers are down dramatically, and what little they do see is often headed for Europe. So it has had a huge impact on the numbers coming into the continental US.
Well, just add something, Bob. Habitat, Oahu, where fishing is allowed, we don't have the habitat that's conducive for large populations of yellow tang. So we do have them here, yellow tang, but not like West Hawaii. The finger parietes are very important for the juveniles when they settle out. They hide in those finger parietes, and we don't have a lot of that around the island of Oahu. So we have far fewer yellow tang. So I would think that yellow tang in particular is going to become far less seen in aquarium stores at probably a much higher price than it used to be.
Yeah, and I guess it does. It makes a difference as far as the life history of the fish as well. I mean, if you're talking about a short-lived species like green chromis, aquaculture is probably never going to be an economic reality because those fish are short-lived. You continually need to bring in new brood stock for your aquaculture program. And honestly, sustainable fisheries for a species with that kind of life history is not so hard to accomplish because they comprise a significant portion of the biomass, and there's also a really high turnover of populations. So as we move forward in the coming years, I guess this is a two-pronged question. Should we expect to see more fisheries like West Hawaii close as a result of individuals that think the ornamental industry is having a conservation impact on the populations of those fish? And second question is, do you see closure of these fisheries as a driver of improvements in aquaculture?
Well, let me just chime in. I think my opening statement might not have been heard very well because of the microphone, but I'll repeat it since it's appropriate to answer your question. But I think if the West Hawaii fishery with all of its data is now shut down, and it's one of the best managed fisheries in the world, then I don't see a lot of hope for other fisheries which are far less managed or not managed at all, or even monitored. I think they are very, very susceptible to the kinds of arguments and pressures that we've experienced here in Hawaii, maybe even more so because they lack the data. And the people who are in positions to make policy decisions can probably very easily be persuaded that what people are doing in other countries or other areas are raping the reefs and destroying these populations, and if you don't stop them, they're all going to go extinct. That's the essence of the arguments that have been made here in Hawaii over the years. And it's, I think, only extended as long as it has because we do have data. It has helped win the day in the legislature. It didn't seem to help any in the courts, however, in the final decision on the EIS. But in other countries, they just aren't managed this way, and I think they're very susceptible. And I think we as a industry, organization, whatever we call ourselves, those of us who have a strong interest in aquariums and their value should be thinking of strategies to counter these very powerful arguments when they start popping up in other places and other fisheries. That's my opinion. Kind of gloomy, but that's what I see.
Paula, is there a role for public aquariums to help educate the general public as to fisheries and sustainability within captive bred fisheries and aquaculture?
Absolutely. I think we play a few roles, to be honest. I think, first of all, many people who come to our facilities and see our exhibits, whether they're large or small, marine exhibits or even freshwater exhibits, many of our guests are inspired, if they are not already home aquarists, to have an aquarium in their home. So by its very nature, my personal feeling on this, and I think it's shared by most of my colleagues, is that we have an obligation to be doing things, in such a way that the message we give to the public is about responsible aquarium keeping in every aspect. So certainly we have a role to play, almost as role models in a sense. We have a role to play as educators. Some facilities are more engaged in actual formal educational settings, but even as in informal educators, in our presentations, in our graphics and things like that, we have a role to play there in telling a story, whether it's the story about the individual animal and its really neat adaptations, or its evolutionary history, or its role in an ecosystem. Depending on what facility you go to, whether it's a zoo or aquarium, people display things differently. It might be very regional. Some of the larger aquariums, some of the best in the world, are very regional and focus only on a certain portion of one ecosystem, for example. So we have so many ways in which we tell stories. And I think one of the most important things that we do is connect people with these living animals. We take them to places they may never go themselves. They might not be a diver. They might not be traveling. Even now, where things are shut down and some of these facilities are shut down, we're doing virtual things through social media, and some aquariums and zoos are doing some incredible online educational things for people who are homeschooling their children, for example. So certainly there's a role for us, but also in the bigger picture, there's a role for us to play because we're all users of the same resource, right? We can't say, oh, well, you're the hobby and we're the public aquariums. We're all getting our animals basically from the same sources. So we have to look at our own sustainability, and we've been doing that for a number of years, but we have some new initiatives that we've been working on. I think that will help, but I think we have to work together. And I think that's important. That's an important role for us to play as well, as working with other related industries in the bigger picture, not only for our own collections and sustainability, but for the natural environment as well.
Thank you, Paula. I just wanted to wrap things up here by asking what the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years looks like for both Hawaii in general and West Hawaii, and then what the listeners, who are majority are at-home aquarium hobbyists, can do to help or take part or help educate other hobbyists.
Over the next 6 months to a year in Hawaii, the island of Oahu is currently going through the public comments they received on their draft environmental impact statement. They will respond to those and publish a final EIS that will then jump through the same hoops as the West Hawaii EIS did. On the West Hawaii side, we are looking at the reasons that were given for rejection and talking with the state and trying to determine the way forward. We are discussing the idea right now of modifying the EIS and going back through the process with that in a way that we hope better answers the concerns that the state expressed or that the land board expressed. That will really come down to a question of resources. You've got fishers, particularly in West Hawaii, fishers that have now been out of the water for over 2 years that are trying to help to fund this. And PJAC has already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this. We desperately need hobbyists and the aquarium trade to contribute to PJAC, to our aquatic fund, and help us continue this fight, because this has been hugely expensive and a much bigger project than PJAC normally takes on. And as I'm sure Kim and Bruce will tell you, nothing in Hawaii goes easily or inexpensively. So the process continues, but we desperately need the support of the industry and the hobby. And without the industry side of it, the hobby side of it just isn't going to have the resources to continue in their hobby.
Beyond the financial commitment, if there's a call and all you have to do is sign your name or, submit a little testimony on what the hobby means to you, why you would like to see it continue to be open, take those 5 minutes. I mean, everyone probably watching this surfs the online forums and, discusses the aquarium trade online to some degree. Take a few minutes and submit comments, submit testimony, and become active in something that you enjoy, that brings you so much happiness, so it can continue, so other people can see aquariums and they can enjoy happiness, and this industry can continue on for years to come.
And Kim, those opportunities are available to hobbyists, no matter if they live in Hawaii or the United States or elsewhere?
Everywhere, worldwide. Anyone can participate, anyone can help. Any way you help is very much appreciated. And, we're always here to answer questions. And, PJAC is a nonprofit. You can pay with your credit card and, just continue to enjoy the trade, the hobby, the fish, and become active.
And to that same point, have these discussions on online forums. That's what they exist for. There are so many passionate hobbyists in this country and globally that want to have these discussions, but I don't see them being had on the global stage. And I think that it's really important that if you are a passionate aquarist, you have a voice in these discussions, because they impact every single person in this hobby. And they're issues that are not going to go away anytime soon. So we need to find ways as a community to to find solutions to these. And in my opinion, one of the best ways to do that is to just open up the discussion and hear from all sides.
I think that's a great point, and I think you know, I'm looking at Paula, and I know it sometimes is a struggle for the industry to talk to the aquarium and zoo folks, and vice versa. And the same cultural divide exists between the hobbyists and the industry in a lot of cases. But those are walls that have to be broken down, because the things that are happening now really affect all of us, and we are all interrelated, as Paula said earlier.
And I think that's the strength of MACNA, if you want to know the truth. It brings together all of us, right? I mean, how many of the speakers are from public aquariums? You know, how many of our employees are hobbyists or used to work in pet stores, right? I did. And so I say this a lot, but if you think of a Venn diagram with the circles, right? There's all these different pieces, but right there in the middle, we all connect, right? We all connect with our interest in our love for, you know, marine fishes, right? And one thing that Bruce used to try to drive home to us, and Bruce, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I do that a lot. And I have to say this, Bruce is huge, being our boots on the ground in Hawaii all these years, is that we need to tell our story, and we need to tell our story in a proud way. We don't need to apologize for the passion that we have for keeping fish in our aquariums and spoiling them for their entire lives. We have a very powerful story to tell. And honestly, when you get on these forums, and I'm on these too, and Kim, I would love it if you could be on the Women in Reefing meetup. You know, we have these powerful stories of how these animals mean, what they mean to people. And when we're fighting an emotional battle, the science is incredibly important. All of us rely on the science, right? We're scientists. But if the legislature or the local court is not listening to the science, where are we fighting fire with fire, so to speak, with our passion and stories? And we have hundreds and thousands or millions of stories. And so, like you said, if we put it on the forums, if we make more videos, if we, you know, it's all about getting creative in how we approach this, either in the future for Hawaii, or if it were to play out somewhere else.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And also, to the same point, zoos and aquariums have an integral role to play in the actual on the ground conservation and ex situ conservation of all of the species that they represent to the public.
Wild collections is one part of that story. You know, we also are looking at and studying aquaculture and trying to learn and support and see what the feasibility of that is in our future. We're trying to look at, you know, marine reserves, and, you know, there's all kinds of different aspects of this that we have the luxury of being involved in at our facilities. But when it comes right down to it, what we're there for is to connect people with animals. And that is what we do best. And I think that's where we are primed to help, as you know, Bob said, in various capacities. Our strength is in our collaboration, I believe.
Well, just to add on to what Paula said, that there's a significant number of marine biologists and aquatic conservation biologists who started out with home aquariums, maybe a couple of guppies or mollies or whatever. The underwater world isn't something you can just casually go and see like you can walk in a forest. So you can't always do that with the ocean or underwater world. And aquariums bring that world right into your home. And kids especially can learn about these animals and fishes. Really, no other way to do it. You can read things in a book and so forth, but seeing it live is a totally different experience. And, you know, I, for one, grew up in Michigan. Coral reef fishes were in my basement from when I was a young kid, and here I am today. And I know a lot of other people in that same situation that were inspired by their aquariums to become conservation biologists. So I think Yeah, I've heard the stories that people only have the aquariums because they're for their trophy fish and so forth. And there may be some of that going on, but there's this other part you can't ignore, that they really do inspire people. And I think, as Paul was saying, we really need to hear more of those stories, especially for the public that has little interest in this, but really should know that that aquariums, the public aquarium or home aquarium, has a significant value. And even if only 1 in 1,000 becomes a marine biologist, that's great, because we need those people to help make sure that we have a good ocean environment well into the future. So that's my closing comments.
Well, thank you, Tim and Kevin, for inviting me to participate in this. I sure appreciate it. Hawaii has been a huge endeavor for us, and we really want to see this thing through and get the fishers back in the water. And we desperately need the help of MACNA participants in order to do that. So, you know, I guess I have to make the plug to go to pjac.org and contribute to the Aquatic Defense Fund. But as Kim said, get involved, learn about the restrictions that are happening, the licenses pulled in Hawaii, how hard it's been to get fish or live sand or coral out of Fiji, even if it is aquaculture. You know, there is a lot happening to our hobby right now that that really, if folks don't get engaged on, is going to put an end to the hobby over the not too distant future.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for participating in this. It's been just really awesome to be able to sit down and pick all of your brains for 45 minutes. I know that's not a lot of time to give this discussion the credit that it deserves, because it is just so complex and there are so many moving parts. But I really, really appreciate you guys sharing your knowledge with us. And I hope that as a result of this discussion, some hobbyists listening to this today, Saturday, at MACNA Online, will be inspired to actually start some of these discussions with their local reefing communities, or contribute, whether that's monetary or via personal support. And also just be encouraged to learn a little bit more about what's going on in their hobby and how that affects them.
Oh, and we'll be there fighting for you at CITES as well.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.